The commander of Panzer IV No. 312 couldn't see anything through the vision port except dust and the back end of the tank ahead of him. It was July 23, 1944, southeast of Lvov, in what had been eastern Poland before the war remade all the maps. Oberfeldwebel Hans Becker had been fighting in Russia for 3 years. He knew what dust meant. It meant the column was moving fast, trying to reach defensive positions before the Soviets caught them in the open. It meant they were retreating again. His driver, a replacement named Friedrich, who'd arrived from training school 6 weeks earlier, kept proper interval with the tank ahead. The engine temperature gauge showed normal. Fuel was at 3/4. Everything was functioning as it should. But Becker knew the statistics, even if headquarters pretended they didn't exist. Of the 18 Panzer IVs, his company had started the summer offensive with at the beginning of Operation Bagration in late June. 5 remained operational. 13 tanks lost in 4 weeks, some knocked out by Soviet tanks, some by anti-tank guns, some abandoned when they threw tracks or engines failed, and there was no time to recover them before Soviet infantry arrived. The ratio was getting worse. In 1941, when Becker had first crossed into the Soviet Union as a gunner in a Panzer III, German armoured units had achieved kill ratios that seemed impossible in retrospect. 10 Soviet tanks destroyed for every German loss, sometimes 20-1. The Soviets had more tanks, certainly, but they died in such numbers that it didn't matter. German crews had been confident, even cocky. Their training was superior. Their tactics were better. Their tanks, while not perfect, were adequate for the enemy they faced. Now, 3 years later, Becker commanded his own tank, and the mathematics had reversed. His company had destroyed perhaps 30 Soviet tanks during the summer fighting, maybe 40 if you counted the possibles. The tanks hit and smoking but not confirmed destroyed. Against 13 German tanks lost. The ratio was roughly 3-1 in favour of the Germans, but that number was misleading. It didn't account for the Germans losing the battle. It didn't account for the Soviets replacing their losses while German replacements never arrived. It didn't account for the fact that the Soviets could afford to trade 3 tanks for 1 and still win. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What had happened? How had the most professional, best-trained armoured force in the world found itself retreating constantly, losing tanks faster than they could be replaced, facing an enemy that seemed to have unlimited numbers of machines and men? The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't just one factor. It was a combination of industrial capacity, strategic decisions, tactical evolution, and the grinding mathematics of attrition warfare on a front that stretched for thousands of miles. Becker's tank reached the assembly area at dusk. The company commander, a captain who looked 20 years older than his actual age of 32, gathered the remaining crew commanders for orders. They would hold this position for 24 hours, covering the withdrawal of infantry units. Then they would fall back another 30 kilometers. The captain didn't say what would happen after that. Nobody asked. They all knew. They would keep falling back until they ran out of fuel, ammunition, or luck. The war that Germany had started with such confidence in 1941 had become a war of survival. And survival, for a German panzer crewman in the summer of 1944, was increasingly unlikely. To understand how German panzer crews reached this desperate situation, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to June 1941, when Operation Barbarossa launched, with 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, and 3,600 tanks rolling east into the Soviet Union. The confidence was not unfounded. It was built on an unbroken string of victories that had shocked the world. In September 1939, German armoured forces had crushed Poland in weeks. In May 1940, they had broken through French defences that were supposed to be impenetrable, reaching the English Channel in 10 days and forcing France to surrender in 6 weeks. In April 1941, they had overrun Yugoslavia and Greece in less than a month. The pattern was consistent. German armour, properly employed in combined arms operations with air support and mechanised infantry, could defeat any opponent. The doctrine was called Bewegungskrieg, War of Movement, though foreign observers called it Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. The concept was elegant. Concentrate armored forces at a weak point in the enemy line, break through with overwhelming local superiority, drive deep into enemy rear areas, disrupting communications and supply lines, encircle enemy forces before they can react, force surrender through disorganization rather than destruction. It had worked brilliantly against Poland, France, and the Balkans. German planners assumed it would work against the Soviet Union. The tanks themselves were not exceptional by 1941 standards, but they were adequate. The Panzer III, which equipped the bulk of German armoured divisions, mounted a 50mm gun and had armour ranging from 30 to 50mm on the frontal hull and turret. It weighed approximately 23 tons and could reach speeds of 40 km per hour on roads. The Panzer IV, originally designed as an infantry support vehicle, mounted a short-barreled 75mm gun and had slightly better armour protection. Both tanks had 5-man crews, radio equipment in every vehicle, good optics, and reliable mechanical systems. More importantly, German tank crews were superbly trained. The average Panzer crewman had undergone months of instruction before joining his unit. Training emphasized not just individual skills, but crew coordination. A German tank crew functioned as a single organism. The commander directed the action with his head out of the turret, maintaining situational awareness. The gunner aimed and fired with precision, using excellent optics. The loader maintained a high rate of fire through efficient ammunition handling. The driver and radio operator kept the tank mobile and maintained communication with other vehicles and higher headquarters. German doctrine emphasized radio communication, allowing rapid coordination and tactical flexibility. The Soviets, by contrast, appeared to be in chaos. Stalin's purges in the late 1930s had decimated the Red Army's officer corps. Experienced commanders had been arrested, tried on fabricated charges, and executed or sent to labor camps. The remaining officers were often promoted beyond their competence, afraid to show initiative, and hampered by political commissars who monitored their decisions. Soviet tactical doctrine, which had been innovative in the early 1930s, had stagnated under the pressure of political conformity. When Barbarossa began, German armoured units achieved exactly the kind of success their doctrine predicted. Soviet tank units were caught in the open, poorly deployed, often out of fuel or ammunition. In the first days of the invasion, the Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground. German panzer divisions raced forward, encircling entire Soviet armies. By December 1941, German forces had captured Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. They had killed or captured over 3 million Soviet soldiers. They stood outside Moscow and Leningrad. The kill ratios in tank combat were extraordinary. German after-action reports documented engagements where a single German tank platoon would destroy 10 or 15 Soviet tanks without loss. The Soviet T-26 light tanks and BT series fast tanks that equipped many Red Army units in 1941 were poorly armoured and mechanically unreliable. Their crews were inadequately trained, often unable to hit targets at combat ranges. Radio equipment was rare, making coordinated action nearly impossible. German gunners could engage Soviet tanks at ranges where the Soviets couldn't effectively return fire. But beneath the surface of these spectacular victories, problems were accumulating. Problems that German commanders either didn't see or chose to ignore. Problems that would eventually transform the confident panzer force of 1941 into the desperate survivors of 1944. The first problem was numbers. Germany had begun Barbarossa with approximately 3,600 tanks. This seemed like an enormous force, and it was by the standards of previous campaigns. But the Soviet Union was not France. The distances were incomprehensible. The front line stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, over 1,500 miles. Roads that appeared on maps turned out to be dirt tracks that became impassable mud in rain. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles from the nearest railhead. Tanks broke down from mechanical wear. They threw tracks on rough ground. Engines overheated in the summer dust or froze in the winter cold. German industry was not prepared for sustained armoured warfare on this scale. Tank production in 1941 was approximately 3,000 vehicles for the entire year. That was barely enough to replace losses, let alone expand the armoured force. By contrast, Soviet tank production in 1941, despite losing huge amounts of industrial territory to the German advance, was approximately 6,400 tanks. The Soviets were producing more than twice as many tanks as Germany, while simultaneously losing catastrophically on the battlefield. The second problem was the T-34. German intelligence had known the Soviets were developing new tanks, but nothing prepared panzer crews for their first encounters with the T-34 medium tank in the summer of 1941. The T-34 combined features that German designers had considered mutually exclusive. It had heavy armour, with 45mm on the frontal hull set at steep angles that effectively doubled the protection. It had a powerful 76mm gun that could penetrate any German tank at normal combat ranges. It had wide tracks that distributed weight and allowed it to cross mud and snow that stopped German vehicles. And it had a reliable diesel engine that gave it good operational range. The first combat reports shocked German commanders. Panzer IIIs and IVs found their standard ammunition bouncing off T-34 armour at ranges where the Soviet tank could penetrate German armour easily. The T-34's sloped armour design meant that even direct hits often ricocheted harmlessly away. Its wide tracks gave it mobility advantages in mud and snow. Its diesel engine was less prone to fires than German gasoline engines and used fuel that was less volatile and more readily available. A German after-action report from October 1941 stated the problem bluntly. The T-34 is superior to our Panzer IV. Its armour cannot be penetrated by our 50mm gun at combat ranges. Its gun penetrates our armour at all ranges. Its mobility is better than ours in difficult terrain. Our only advantages are crew training and tactical skill. Those advantages were real. German crews were better trained. German tactics were more sophisticated. German commanders showed more initiative. In individual engagements, well-handled German tanks could often defeat T-34 seconds through superior positioning, better use of terrain, and coordinated fire. But this required circumstances to favour the Germans. It required ambush, positions or defensive terrain. It required numerical parity or superiority at the point of contact. And increasingly, as 1941 turned to 1942 and then to 1943, those circumstances became rarer. The Soviet Union was doing something that seemed impossible by the logic of conventional warfare. It was losing catastrophically while simultaneously growing stronger. In 1941, the Red Army lost approximately 20,000 tanks. This represented nearly the entire pre-war tank force. German commanders watched Soviet units disintegrate, saw thousands of tanks destroyed or abandoned, and assumed they were witnessing the collapse of Soviet armoured capability. They were wrong. Soviet factories, many of them evacuated eastward ahead of the German advance, were producing tanks at rates that defied German comprehension. The Kirov plant in Leningrad, the Kharkov locomotive factory, and dozens of other facilities had been dismantled, transported by rail to the Urals and beyond, and reassembled in new locations. Workers lived in tents and dugouts while they rebuilt their factories. They worked 12-hour shifts in unheated buildings through the winter of 1941 to 1942. Production continued even as the factories were being relocated. The T-34 was designed for this kind of mass production. Its welded hull was simpler to manufacture than German tanks with their complex interlocking plates and bolted construction. Its Christie suspension used large road wheels that were easier to produce than the German system of smaller wheels on torsion bars. Its diesel engine, while crude by German standards, was reliable and could be manufactured in existing tractor engine factories. Soviet engineers had deliberately chosen simplicity over sophistication. By 1942, Soviet tank production reached 24,600 vehicles. Germany produced 9,300 tanks that same year. The ratio was better than 2.5 to 1 in Soviet favour. But those numbers understated the disparity because they didn't account for quality improvements. The T-34 was being constantly refined. The original T-34, model 1940, had a cramped two-man turret and poor visibility. The T-34 model 1943 introduced a larger three-man turret with a commander's cupola, greatly improving combat effectiveness. Production methods improved, reducing manufacturing time and cost, while maintaining or improving quality. German production, by contrast, was fragmenting. Instead of focusing on a few standard designs that could be mass-produced, German industry was building an increasingly complex array of vehicles. The Panzer III was being phased out. The Panzer IV was being upgunned with a longer 75mm cannon and additional armour, increasing its weight and reducing reliability. New designs were entering production. The Panther medium tank, the Tiger heavy tank, and various assault guns and tank destroyers. Each design required unique parts, specialized manufacturing equipment, and separate supply chains. The result was a logistical nightmare. A German armoured division by 1943 might have 4 or 5 different types of tanks, each requiring different ammunition, different spare parts, and different maintenance procedures. When a Panzer IV threw a track, you needed Panzer IV track links to repair it. When a Tiger broke down, which happened frequently, you needed Tiger-specific parts that were often unavailable at the front. Soviet units, equipped almost entirely with T-34 seconds, could cannibalize damaged vehicles to keep others running. The training disparity that had favored Germany so heavily in 1941 was also narrowing. Soviet tank crews in the first year of the war were often poorly trained, sometimes with only a few hours of instruction before being sent into combat. Crews didn't know how to maintain their vehicles properly. Drivers ground gears and burned out clutches. Gunners couldn't estimate range accurately. Commanders had no idea how to coordinate with other tanks or with supporting infantry. But the Soviets were learning. Survivors of the catastrophic losses of 1941 and 1942 were becoming veterans. They understood their tanks' capabilities. They learned which German tanks could be engaged frontally and which required flanking attacks. They developed tactics that used the T-34's advantages in mobility and armour while compensating for its disadvantages in crew ergonomics and vision equipment. Training programs improved as the Soviets established new training facilities in rear areas where crews could practice for weeks or even months before deployment. German training, conversely, was deteriorating. The need for replacements was constant. Experienced crews were killed or wounded and had to be replaced with men who had received abbreviated training. A Panzer crewman in 1941 might have trained for 6 months before joining his unit. By 1943, replacement crews sometimes arrived with only 6 weeks of instruction. They didn't know their tanks intimately. They hadn't practiced crew coordination until it became instinctive. They made mistakes that veterans would never make, and those mistakes got them killed quickly. The fuel situation was becoming critical. Germany had always been dependent on imported petroleum. Romania provided crude oil from the Ploesti fields, but it was never enough for Germany's military and industrial needs. Synthetic fuel production from coal helped, but the synthetic plants were complex facilities that required enormous investments and were vulnerable to bombing. As the war progressed, fuel allocations for training decreased. New crews arrived at the front with minimal driving experience. They didn't know how to handle their tanks in difficult terrain or how to conserve fuel during long movements. The collision between German assumptions and Soviet reality reached its breaking point at Kursk in July 1943. German commanders planned Operation Citadel as a decisive offensive that would encircle and destroy large Soviet forces, shortening the front line and regaining the initiative lost after the disaster at Stalingrad. The plan concentrated virtually every available German armoured unit for a double envelopment. The northern pincer would attack south from the Orel salient. The southern pincer would attack north from the Belgorod-Kharkov area. The two forces would meet near Kursk, trapping Soviet forces in a massive pocket. German intelligence knew the Soviets were fortifying the Kursk salient. Reconnaissance flights and interrogation of prisoners revealed extensive defensive preparations, but German commanders believed their new equipment would overcome Soviet defenses. The Panther tank was entering service, with its powerful 75mm gun and well-sloped armour. The Tiger heavy tank, already proven in combat, would be available in greater numbers. New Ferdinand tank destroyers mounting 88mm guns would provide devastating anti-tank firepower. What German intelligence failed to grasp was the scale of Soviet preparation. The Red Army had 6 weeks of warning before Citadel began. They used that time to construct defensive positions of extraordinary depth and complexity. The main defensive belt extended 10 to 15 miles deep. Behind it was a second defensive belt. Behind that was a third. In total, the Soviets prepared defensive positions extending 50 miles deep in some sectors. They laid over 400,000 anti-tank mines. They positioned thousands of anti-tank guns in carefully prepared positions with overlapping fields of fire. They held large armoured reserves to counterattack any German breakthrough. The offensive began on July 5, 1943. Within hours, German commanders realized something was wrong. The advance was measured in miles per day, not the dozens of miles that characterized successful operations. Soviet defensive fire was intense and accurate. Anti-tank guns engaged German armor from positions that had been precisely ranged. Minefields channeled German tanks into killing zones. When German units broke through the first defensive line, they found themselves facing a second line, equally strong. The Panthers, which were supposed to give Germany a technological edge, proved mechanically unreliable. Of the 200 Panthers committed to the offensive, many broke down before reaching combat. Their final drives failed, their engines overheated, their transmissions jammed. Repair crews worked through the nights trying to keep them operational. The Tigers performed better mechanically but consumed fuel at rates that strained supply lines. A Tiger could travel about 60 miles on internal fuel. Forward supply dumps often couldn't keep up with the advance, forcing Tigers to stop and wait for fuel trucks. Soviet T-34 seconds appeared in numbers that shocked German crews. Intelligence had estimated Soviet armoured strength in the salient, but the estimates proved low. When German units broke through Soviet defensive positions, expecting to find rear areas and vulnerable support units, they instead encountered fresh tank brigades moving forward to counterattack. The Soviets were feeding reinforcements into the battle faster than Germans could destroy them. On July 12th, the Soviets launched their own offensive against the Orel salient north of Kursk. German forces that had been committed to the Kursk offensive now had to be diverted to prevent a Soviet breakthrough in another sector. On July 13th, Hitler cancelled Operation Citadel. The offensive had failed to achieve any of its objectives. German forces withdrew to their starting positions, having lost approximately 200 tanks and assault. Guns destroyed, with hundreds more damaged. Soviet losses were higher in absolute numbers, but the Red Army could replace them. Germany could not. After Kursk, the character of the war changed fundamentally. The Soviets held the initiative and never relinquished it. They launched a series of offensives, one after another, giving German forces no time to rest or rebuild. The Red Army recaptured Kharkov in August. They crossed the Dnieper River in October. By November, they had liberated Kiev. Each offensive consumed German armoured units. Each defensive battle resulted in losses that couldn't be replaced. The mathematics of attrition were relentless. A German panzer division in 1943 was authorized approximately 200 tanks and assault guns. After a month of combat, it might have 80 or 90 operational vehicles. After 2 months, perhaps 50. The division would be pulled from the line, designated as refitting, and sent to a rear area to receive replacements. But replacements arrived slowly, if at all. A division that had been pulled out with 50 tanks might receive 30 replacement vehicles over 6 weeks. Before it could be fully reconstituted, it would be committed to combat again to meet some new crisis. Soviet tank brigades faced the same attrition, but Soviet production ensured continuous replacement. A Soviet tank brigade reduced to 30 operational tanks could be rebuilt to full strength within weeks. Replacement tanks arrived from factories. Replacement crews arrived from training units. The brigade would be pulled from frontline combat for a brief period, integrate its replacements, and return to action. The cycle was sustainable because production exceeded losses. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By early 1944, the disparity was visible in unit strength reports. A typical German panzer division on the Eastern Front had between 40 and 70 operational tanks. The authorized strength was nearly 200. The gap represented losses that couldn't be replaced. Meanwhile, Soviet tank armies were operating at close to full strength, with hundreds of tanks concentrated for breakthrough operations. Operation Bagration, launched on June 22, 1944, demonstrated the complete reversal of the 1941 situation. The Soviets attacked across a 450-mile front with overwhelming superiority. The Red Army committed over 2,400,000 men, 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 36,000 artillery pieces. German forces defending in Belorussia had approximately 800,000 men, 900 tanks and assault guns, and fewer than 10,000 artillery pieces. The Soviet offensive destroyed entire German army groups. The encirclement at Minsk trapped over 100,000 German soldiers. The rate of advance exceeded anything the Germans had achieved in 1941. Soviet mechanized units drove forward 50 to 60 miles per day, bypassing German defensive positions and reaching the rear areas. German panzer divisions committed to stop the breakthrough were overwhelmed by superior numbers. Tank companies that started an engagement with 10 operational vehicles might finish with 3 or 4. The survivors would withdraw, regroup, and be committed again days later, with no time to receive proper maintenance or replacement crews. Individual tank commanders watched their companies disappear. Hans Becker, commanding Panzer IV No. 312 southeast of Lvov in late July, was one of 5 tank commanders left from a company that had started June with 14 tanks. The other 9 tanks had been destroyed or abandoned. 3 of them had been knocked out by T-34 seconds in a single engagement near Bobroysk. 2 had been destroyed by anti-tank guns during a defensive action. 1 had thrown its transmission and been abandoned when Soviet infantry overran the position before it could be recovered. 1 had been destroyed by air attack. 2 had been lost to circumstances the survivors didn't fully understand. They simply didn't return from a patrol, and their wrecks were found later in Soviet-held territory. The casualty statistics for German panzer crews in 1944 tell a story that no amount of propaganda could obscure. Exact figures are difficult to establish because German record-keeping collapsed under the pressure of continuous retreat, but surviving unit records and post-war analysis provide reasonable estimates. Tank crew casualties on the Eastern Front in 1944 ran between 70 and 85% for units engaged in sustained combat operations. This didn't mean that 85% of all panzer crewmen died. It meant that of 100 men serving in Stalingrad tank crews at the beginning of the year, 85 would be killed, wounded, or missing by the end of the year. The distinction mattered to the men experiencing it. Being wounded and evacuated counted as a casualty statistically, but it meant survival. Many wounded crewmen never returned to their units. They recovered in hospitals in Germany or occupied territories, and by the time they were fit for duty, their original units had been destroyed or disbanded. Some wounded men were reassigned to training units or to garrison duty in rear areas. This was not cowardice. It was the military bureaucracy making rational decisions about where to place men with combat experience who were no longer fully fit for frontline service. But for crews still at the front, the mathematics were inescapable. If your company started the summer with 45 men in 9 tank crews and current casualty rates held, you could expect 38 of those men to become casualties within 6 months. The question wasn't whether you would be hit. The question was when, and whether you would survive it. This knowledge changed how men approached combat. The aggressive confidence of 1941, when German crews believed they were invincible, had given way to a grim fatalism. Oberfeldwebel Hans Becker understood this better than most. He had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front through a combination of skill, experience, and luck. He knew how to read terrain. He knew when to advance and when to withdraw. He knew how to position his tank to maximize protection while maintaining fields of fire. He knew the sound of incoming artillery and could distinguish the crack of an anti-tank gun from the whoosh of a rocket. But he also knew that all his experience and skill couldn't guarantee survival when the odds were so heavily stacked against him. The crew of Panzer IV No. 312 had changed completely since Becker took command in early 1943. His original gunner had been killed by artillery at Kursk. The replacement gunner was wounded by a mine explosion and evacuated. The current gunner, a man named Otto, had been with the crew for 4 months, which made him a veteran by current standards. The loader was on his 2nd week. The previous loader had been killed when a T-34 round penetrated the turret. The driver, Friedrich, was competent but inexperienced. The radio operator was adequate but constantly nervous, which made everyone else nervous. This was typical. Veteran commanders found themselves leading crews composed primarily of replacements who hadn't had time to develop the instinctive coordination that made a tank crew effective. You couldn't train that coordination in a classroom or even on a training ground. It developed through shared experience, through dozens of engagements where crew members learned each other's rhythms and anticipated each other's actions. But there was no time for that kind of development anymore. Replacements arrived, fought for a few weeks, and became casualties. New replacements arrived. The cycle continued. The psychological strain was enormous. Tank combat required men to function in extremely confined spaces under conditions of extraordinary stress. When your tank was hit, you had seconds to determine whether to stay and fight or bail out. Stay too long, and you might burn to death. Bail out prematurely, and you abandoned your vehicle unnecessarily. The decision had to be made while your ears were ringing from the impact, while your vision was obscured by dust and smoke, while you couldn't be certain whether the hit had penetrated or whether another round was incoming. Men developed coping mechanisms. Some became fatalistic, convinced they would die and therefore indifferent to danger. Others became obsessively cautious, reluctant to expose their tanks to any risk. The best crews, the ones most likely to survive, found a middle ground. They took necessary risks but didn't take unnecessary ones. They fought aggressively when circumstances favored them and withdrew when they didn't. But maintaining that balance required constant judgment under pressure, and even experienced commanders made mistakes. By December 1944, when Becker's tank was withdrawn to Germany for the Ardennes offensive, the disparity between German and Soviet armoured forces had reached levels that made continued resistance militarily irrational. The Red Army had approximately 12,000 tanks and self-propelled guns operational on the Eastern Front. Germany had approximately 4,000 tanks and assault guns divided between the Eastern Front and the West. Soviet production in 1944 was 29,000 tanks. German production was 19,000 tanks and assault guns, a number inflated by including vehicles that were technically not tanks but self-propelled guns and tank destroyers. The quality gap had also shifted. The Panther and Tiger, tanks that entered service in 1943, were technically superior to the T-34 inches armour protection and firepower. The Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate T-34 armour at ranges exceeding 1.5 miles. The Tiger's 88mm gun was even more powerful, but these advantages were theoretical. In practice, Panthers and Tigers fought at the same close ranges as other tanks, where their superior guns provided less advantage, and their mechanical complexity meant they spent more time under repair than in combat. The T-34 model 1944, meanwhile, had closed the gap. It wasn't as well armoured as a Panther or as heavily armed as a Tiger, but it was reliable, easy to maintain, and available in enormous numbers. Soviet tank crews had learned to use terrain and combined arms tactics to compensate for individual vehicle inferiority. A single T-34 engaging a Panther frontally would likely lose. 5 T-34 seconds engaging a Panther from multiple directions would likely win, and the Soviets always had more tanks available for concentration at critical points. The training and experience advantage that Germany had possessed in 1941 had completely reversed. Soviet tank crews by late 1944 were often combat veterans with months or years of experience. They knew their tanks intimately. They understood German tactics and had developed effective counters. Soviet commanders at all levels, from platoon leaders to army commanders, had survived the catastrophic learning experience of 1941 and 1942. The officers who had proven incompetent were dead or removed from command. The survivors were skilled professionals. German tank crews, by contrast, were increasingly composed of young replacements with minimal training. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 demonstrated this starkly. German armoured units achieved initial surprise and made significant gains in the first days. But when American forces recovered from the initial shock and brought their superior numbers to bear, the offensive collapsed. German tanks ran out of fuel. Crews without adequate training made tactical mistakes. The attack failed, and Germany lost tanks and experienced crews it could not replace. Becker survived the Ardennes. His tank was knocked out on December 19th by American tank destroyers, but his crew escaped. They were assigned a replacement Panther and sent east to face the Soviet offensive into Germany itself. The final battles in Poland and Germany in 1945 were exercises in futility. Soviet forces had overwhelming superiority in every category. German units fought defensive actions, fell back, fought again, fell back again. There was no realistic hope of victory. The best that could be hoped for was to delay the inevitble and allow as many civilians and soldiers as possible to reach American or British lines rather than Soviet captivity. Becker's final engagement came in March 1945, east of Berlin. His Panther, along with 4 other tanks from various depleted units, was positioned to defend a road junction. Soviet forces attacked with an entire tank brigade, approximately 60 T-34 seconds, supported by infantry and artillery. The engagement lasted less than an hour. The 5 German tanks destroyed perhaps 15 Soviet tanks before being overwhelmed. Becker's Panther was hit multiple times. The crew bailed out. The loader was killed by small arms fire during the evacuation. The other 4 men made it to German lines. Becker was wounded in the leg but survived. He spent the remaining weeks of the war in a field hospital, then in American captivity after Germany's surrender. In interviews conducted decades later, he described the progression of his experiences with remarkable clarity. In 1941, he had believed Germany would win quickly. The Soviet Union seemed chaotic, its military incompetent, its equipment inferior. In 1942, he believed Germany could still win through superior skill and determination, despite Soviet numerical advantages. In 1943, after Kursk, he began to doubt. The Soviets were learning, adapting, growing stronger. By 1944, he knew Germany would lose. The only question was when and how bad the defeat would be. The story of German panzer crews on the Eastern Front is often told as a tale of tactical excellence, overwhelmed by numerical superiority. There is truth in that narrative, but it misses the deeper lesson. The German defeat wasn't simply about numbers, it was about industrial capacity, strategic sustainability, and the fundamental requirements of modern warfare between industrialized nations. Germany entered the war with a military designed for short, decisive campaigns. The tank force was optimized for breakthrough operations that would end quickly with the enemy's collapse. The entire logistical structure assumed wars would be won in weeks or months, not years. There were no provisions for sustaining massive armored forces across thousands of miles of front line indefinitely. There was no industrial base capable of replacing losses at the rate modern combat inflicted them. The Soviet Union, despite catastrophic losses in the first year of the war, had the industrial infrastructure to sustain long-term mechanized warfare. Soviet factories could produce tanks faster than they were destroyed in combat. Soviet training establishments could produce crews faster than they became casualties. The system was wasteful and inefficient by some measures, but it was adequate for the strategic requirement. Maintain armored forces in the field continuously until the enemy's capacity to resist was exhausted. This was the collision that Oberfeldwebel Becker and thousands of other German tank commanders experienced. They had been trained in a tradition of tactical excellence. They understood their equipment. They knew how to fight. But tactical excellence couldn't overcome strategic insufficiency. A company of superbly trained tank crews in excellent vehicles could defeat a battalion of poorly trained Soviets in inferior vehicles. But when the Soviets had 3 battalions available and could replace losses while the German company could not, The outcome was predetermined. The 82% loss rate among German panzer crews in 1944 was not the result of superior Soviet tactical prowess at the individual or small unit level. German crews, on average, were still more skilled. German tanks, at least the newer models, were still technically superior in many respects. The loss rate reflected the mathematics of attrition warfare waged without adequate resources. When you cannot replace your losses, every engagement reduces your strength. When your opponent can replace losses faster than you inflict them, every engagement increases their relative advantage. The trajectory is inexorable. The psychological journey of German tank crews from confidence to desperation mirrors Germany's broader experience in the war. The early victories created an illusion of invincibility. The belief that superior training, tactics, and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages was comforting, but false. Modern industrial warfare between peer nations is fundamentally a contest of production capacity, resource availability, and logistical sustainability. The side that can build more tanks, train more crews, and supply them with fuel and ammunition will eventually prevail if they avoid catastrophic strategic errors. Soviet errors in 1941 were indeed catastrophic, allowing Germany to achieve spectacular initial successes. But the Soviet Union had the geographic depth to absorb those losses and the industrial capacity to rebuild. Germany had neither. Once the war settled into sustained attrition, the outcome was determined by factors far beyond the control of individual tank commanders making tactical decisions on the battlefield. Hans Becker returned to civilian life after his release from American captivity in 1946. He worked in reconstruction, helping rebuild the Germany that the war had destroyed. He rarely spoke about his experiences to people who hadn't served. When he did discuss the war with other veterans, he focused on the specifics: terrain, weather, equipment, the small details of survival. He avoided grand pronouncements about causes or meaning, but in an interview conducted in the 1970s, he offered a reflection that captured the experience of German tank crews in the final years of the war. "We fought as well as we could with what we had," he said. "We followed orders and did our duty. But by 1944, we knew we were losing. Not because we weren't good enough, because there were simply too many of them and not enough of us. You can be the best tank crew in the world, but when you face 5 enemy tanks for every one of yours, and they can replace their losses and you cannot, mathematics decides the outcome." That mathematical reality, more than any tactical innovation or technological breakthrough, explains why German panzer crews suffered such catastrophic losses in the final years of the war. They were fighting a war their nation's industrial base could not sustain against opponents whose industrial capacity was vastly greater. The courage and skill of individual soldiers couldn't change that fundamental imbalance. The dust that Oberfeldwebel Becker saw from his tank commander's position in July 1944 was not just the dust of retreat, it was the dust of a military force being ground down by the inexorable mathematics of industrial attrition warfare. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.